In the Commons today, she maintained that there was no evidence to support the claims of Mr. Colin Wallace, the former Army press officer in Northern Ireland, who was sacked for leaking a document. When the Defence Secretary Tom King made a statement to MPs later, he faced a barrage of criticism about the scope of the Calcutt inquiry into Mr. Wallace's dismissal. He stressed that the new documents, which had come to light early last year, cast doubts merely on Mr. Wallace's appeal and on no other matter. Our political correspondent Anne Perkins reports.
Tom King, just back from Washington, told Cabinet that the first doubts about previous statements on the Wallace affair had been raised early last year. Further inquiries had revealed that Mr. Wallace had, perhaps, been authorised to pass on disinformation in his job as an Army information officer. The Prime Minister was told that despite further inquiries there was no new evidence of a smear campaign in the early 70s, as two previous inquiries, one in 1977, the other 3 years ago, had also found. But MPs also wanted to know if Colin Wallace's allegations of high-level involvement in the Kincora Boys' Home scandal were substantiated, and if there was new evidence even relating to the Stalker inquiry. But the central question was, had there been subversion?
Is the Prime Minister not aware that when the Wallace case raises serious issues of civil liberties and serious allegations of efforts to discredit members of Parliament and to undermine elected governments, it would be intolerable if she proposed to do absolutely nothing other than to hide behind anonymous civil servants?
My own statement of the 6th of May 1987 was not affected by the new information. Nor does the new information provide any evidence of attempts to undermine or discredit ministers.
The Prime Minister's assurances did not satisfy opposition MPs.
Will she not now think again, both about the need for a wider inquiry into the implications of this matter and to the accountability of the security services? Is it not the case that when ministers are not directly answerable to Parliament for things, those things are less adequately covered by civil servants' accountability to them?
An attempt by Michael Heseltine to suggest that Labour, having been in government at the time, was ultimately responsible, brought the former Northern Ireland Secretary Merlin Rees to his feet to point out his evidence of a smear campaign related to the period when there was still a Conservative government.
Statement, Mr. Secretary King.
The Defence Secretary's statement, when it finally came, confirmed the narrowness of the inquiry and the government's determination to resist all attempts to broaden it.
Make a statement about the case. Mr. Speaker, I can't quite understand then why the government should feel the need to be on the defensive.
Yes, that's right.
Does the Secretary of State not accept that all of these named ought to have their integrity confirmed by an investigation much wider than anything which has so far been proposed?
Can I say to the right honourable gentleman, now for the second time we have these allegations about lots of names. I don't know where these names, on what lists they were on, what is alleged,
The Defence Secretary's lot was made no easier when the Tory backbencher in whose constituency Colin Wallace lives pointed out that 6 files relating to the affair are still missing. And most damagingly, Merlin Rees rose again.
The Prime Minister refers to the inquiry into the security services carried out by the noble Lord Callaghan and myself. And ever since the Prime Minister, who doesn't know what was in it, but that doesn't prevent her to say everything was covered. And I make it abundantly clear that these dirty tricks in Northern Ireland were not covered in that inquiry. Now, I'm the only one that knows. The Secretary of State cannot deny it. And I simply say, Mr. Speaker, this will not go away. There is no hiding place. And the next Labour government will look at it. And those who are hiding things from this government had better remember that.
To Tories demanding a wider inquiry, Mr. King pointed out that he did have access to the findings of a more recent investigation.
I obviously do not have access to that information. What I do have access to are the findings of the Director General of the Security Service, in which I have no reason to disagree, in which to share the view of the Prime Minister, as she made clear in her statement, that she accepted fully the assurance and advice which he had given her, and I'm sure the House will do the same.
Mr. King took questions for well over an hour, but though he had support from some Tories, he left many MPs dissatisfied.
Anne Perkins reporting. Well, joining me now is the man at the centre of the allegations, Colin Wallace. Mr. Wallace, it's quite evident from today's proceedings that neither the Prime Minister nor the Defence Secretary believe that the smear campaign extended to senior British politicians. Why should they believe your allegations?
Well, I think first of all I'm grateful for the concessions they've made, but quite clearly the evidence does exist. There's an abundance of evidence, and if the government have not got that information in their possession, then they have not carried out the investigations they claim they have done.
But why should anyone believe that you, an army press officer, quite naturally in a state of war presumably, were spreading disinformation about the enemy, the IRA, suddenly then found himself involved in a plot to discredit the Prime Minister of the day?
Well, I think first of all it's one thing to try and discredit a terrorist organisation. It's an entirely different thing to use official information against elected politicians. But one must remember that in 1975 I briefed my London solicitors on these attempts. I also had an interview with the Labour Junior Minister in the presence of my solicitor, and I wrote to the then Prime Minister, Sir Harold Wilson, personally about this. So this predates all the evidence provided by Peter Wright and by Harold Wilson himself.
Now, who are you saying was running this campaign?
Well, it's very difficult to know. All I can say is that in 1973 and 1974, in my official capacity at Headquarters Northern Ireland, I received information that could only be described as political disinformation, and was asked to produce that into a format that could be disseminated to the media.
Now, are any of these people that you served with and who were involved, therefore, in this Operation Clockwork Orange, this smear campaign, do you imagine now in positions of authority in the Ministry of Defence?
It's difficult to be certain. Two of them certainly have retired, and I'm not sure about the rest of them.
Now, I must put it to you again, it is after all 15 years after the original allegations. Nobody believed them then, and people are only partially believing them now. Why should they now believe them all these years on?
Well, I think first of all the government over the last 2 years have consistently denied quite a number of my allegations. They've now made admission that some of these were true. I believe in fact that if documents are now coming to light after all this time, that more information will come out. And after all, the government's credibility on this issue is not particularly strong.
But given that they are not prepared to reveal these documents, you have no further means of proving your case.
No, I think all I can do is continue what I have been doing for the past 14 years and to press for a proper inquiry. It's quite clear that the terms of the inquiry announced this week are not adequate, and one must therefore press for a more comprehensive one.
But as we've seen on the floor of the House today, the paraphernalia exists. Secrecy one administration to another, secrecy between people you served with and each other. Surely make this an impossible task.
Well, I don't think anything is impossible. It may not happen in the life of this government, as Merlin Rees says, but after all, he was a former Home Secretary responsible for Security Service. He was a former Northern Ireland Secretary. If he demands an inquiry into what happened during his period, surely the House must listen to what he's asking for.
Colin Wallace, thank you very much.
In the 70s.
That the only possible reason for the inclusion of our names was a direct attempt to interfere with the processes of parliamentary democracy.
It's also claimed that Merlin Rees was one of the main targets of black propaganda.
This will not go away. There is no hiding place, and the next Labour government will look at it, and those who are hiding things from this government had better remember that.
Against Labour's offensive, support for the government.
There is no evidence that there was subversion, and until anybody can produce proper evidence, there is no need to have an inquiry into that.
Repudiate.
During heated exchanges, Mr. King ran into trouble for accusing some MPs of simply trying to discredit the security services.
I said one or two of those contributors. Of course.
Order! 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 But I say, Section, even that is a reflection upon the honour of honourable members in this House.
Mr. Speaker, if you take that view, I most certainly withdraw.
Tonight, attention focused on why, after a number of major inquiries into claims against the security services, key defence documents were not available until now, and why their existence wasn't acknowledged last year.
One does ask oneself, is the material in some way being held up willfully? Is it in problems of inefficiency? Or, what is the reasoning? Because this sort of long drawn-out process before coming to response does worry one, and I think adds to uncertainty and maybe concern about whether we've got all the stuff we now need, which I hope we have.
Meanwhile, the man at the centre of this dispute offers his verdict.
This is an opportunity the government had to deal with the matter once and for all, and I would have hoped from today's statement in the House that that's what they would have done, but sadly they haven't.
The argument tonight is deadlocked, with, on the one hand, the government insisting that there's no evidence to support Colin Wallace's claims, and with the opposition insisting that the only way of finding out is to have a full independent inquiry. But for the moment, on that, the government is standing firm.
Claims that information about homosexual behaviour at the Kincora Boys' Home in Belfast was used to blackmail prominent figures in Northern Ireland. That's why Mr. Kinnock said that far more was needed than just inquiries into Wallace's dismissal.
Go away. There is no hiding place.
Who wrote this material? We want to know. And if the inquiry doesn't deal with these matters, then the inquiry is a whitewash.
A Conservative, Jonathan Aitken, was also worried.
This matter will not go away as quickly as some hope, and I think sooner or later we will have to have a fuller inquiry by the head of the security services.
But an increasingly impatient Defence Secretary refused to go into the wider charges.
And people jumping up and down, one after the other, and I could join the club. If people jumping up and down, alleging they have evidence, if they have evidence, produce it, and that matter can be properly investigated.
But Mr. King also revealed that the first of the documents which have led to this matter being re-examined was found, quote, early last year. Many MPs got the impression earlier this week that what's brought the Colin Wallace affair back into the frame is the sudden and very recent discovery of documents at the Ministry of Defence. But now we're told that the inquiry there has been going on for almost a year, prompted, we are told, by the accidental discovery of the document which originally set up Colin Wallace's job. The internal inquiry in the Ministry of Defence is going to look into why that document has lain undiscovered for some 15 years. MPs certainly want to know the answer to that, but they want to know the answers to many other questions besides. Michael Brunson, News at 10, Westminster.
Colin Wallace didn't really expect a major government announcement today, but nevertheless he is a disappointed man tonight.
I think it's very much what I expected. Basically, the government are prepared to admit mistakes that occurred during the previous administration, but they're not prepared to deal with the more contentious political matters that have relevance to the current government. And I say that's very much as I expected.
Yeah. Mr. King said he was solely concerned really with any possible injustice that might have been done to you at your civil service appeal.
Well, I'm pleased to hear that, but I think that injustice to me is really a minor matter. The much more important matters are the allegations that there was an attempt to influence the general elections in 1974, and indeed the assaults on the children in Kincora during the 70s. My aspect of the story really is only a minor one by comparison. The other point is that in 1975 I gave full details of the discrediting campaign to my London solicitors. Now to date, not a single person from either the police or the government have ever been to see him. And one must remember that those allegations were made long before Peter Wright made them, or indeed even before Harold Wilson himself complained about attempts to discredit his government. Well, the government did make, I think, a genuine attempt this week to rectify the situation. What worries me is that they did not give the current inquiry sufficiently wide terms of reference to get at the contention.